Welcome to CharityVillage Connects. I'm Mary Barrow. According to the 2022 Canadian Survey on Disability, the employment rate for persons with disabilities currently sits at 62%. While this figure has risen in recent years, up from 59% in the 2017 survey, it's clear that a lot more progress must be made in creating more inclusive and accessible workplaces for Canadians with disabilities. We're talking to accessibility experts from across the sector to find out about the challenges and barriers that contribute to this employment gap, along with what nonprofit organizations can do to address these barriers within workplaces, programming, and communities. Joining me to discuss these important issues is Lorin MacDonald. For decades, human rights lawyer and accessibility advocate, Lorin MacDonald has demonstrated leadership, passion, and commitment to accessibility and inclusion in her volunteer and professional activities. Informed by her lived experience as a woman born with profound hearing loss, recognized as one of Canada's disability leaders and highly regarded by the human rights legal community, Lorin is committed to increased disability and accessibility awareness. Now, Lorin is teaching disability law at TMU School of Law. In 2021, Canadian Lawyer magazine named her one of the top 25 most influential lawyers in the human rights category. In 2022, the Law Society of Ontario awarded Lorin the Law Society Medal for outstanding service for making the legal profession more accessible and inclusive. She was inducted into the Canadian Disability Hall of Fame and became a member of the Order of Ontario. In 2023, Diversability included her on its disability impact list as one of 30 disability leaders from 12 countries worldwide. And she received the Governor General's Award in commemoration of the Persons Case, celebrating those working to advance gender equality. Welcome to the podcast, Lorin.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'd like to start by introducing our listeners to your human rights work, and I know it's a long list, but what brought you to become a human rights lawyer, and how do you feel that work is creating change in Canada?
Well, as you mentioned, Mary, I was born with profound hearing loss, and so my work is really coming to this work really stems from a personal commitment to advancing the rights of people with disabilities. And certainly I've experienced discrimination over the years. And so I have my lived experiences that I can rely on, and my values surrounding equality, justice, and accessibility, which are values that were instilled in me by my family. And so as I was advocating for the rights of people with disabilities, that was a powerful motivation to enter the field of law. I started law school as a mature student because I came to realize that there's certainly a lot of excellent work being done at the grassroots level, but if I had that additional knowledge of the law and legal frameworks and such, I would be perhaps more effective. And so having had that now, I'm able to create change in Canada by challenging the barriers that persist, by shaping the legal conversations that happen, and influencing policies that promote accessibility and inclusion. And in particular, by focusing on the intersection of disability and law, I contribute to advancing the legal rights of people with disabilities, ensuring that they have equal access to services, certainly employment, as you mentioned, whose rates are shameful, in my opinion, and public spaces. And so I try to encourage more equitable frameworks that benefit not only Canadians living with disabilities, but the broader society And we have to shift the culture to be more inclusive and more respectful of human dignity. And so that's a bit of an intro into why I do this work. And I've been very pleased. It's been 20 years that I started law school, and I'm pleased to see the trajectory that my life has taken. It's never always linear. It's never what you thought it would be when you started law school, but I'm happy to say that I've created some impact.
And what are some of your wins that you're most proud of?
I'm fortunate to have many. Um, Certainly, my work with the bringing about the Accessibility for Ontarians with Disabilities Act, or the AODA. It was the summer before law school that I answered a call to help organize a forum to convince the Ontario government to enact stronger disability legislation. And so I thought, oh, this could be an interesting opportunity. And that forum was held, ironically, today, back, let's see, in 2004. So 20 years ago today, mindful that this may not be the day that folks are seeing this, but on September 11th, 2020, 2004, the forum was held at the University of Western Ontario, as it was then called, and it ultimately brought together community members from across Ontario. It was fully inclusive. It was broadcast on cable television and brought together political leaders, the policy decision makers, and ultimately resulted in the introduction of the AODA 6 weeks later after the forum. And then by May of 2005, we saw the passage of the AODA. And so that was really powerful to me to see how, first, as a law student, very new law student, on the ground, having the opportunity to be involved with that. And then, of course, after the AODA was passed, I was invited to sit on the Customer Service Standard Development Committee, which was the first standard. And so, as with being a pioneer, the first is always the toughest. And there were some pretty knock out fights that were happening because we wanted to ensure that the nothing about us without us philosophy was being maintained. And then I was invited to work on the last last standard under the AODA, which was healthcare. And so our work finished in 2022 on that, and we're waiting for it to become regulation. So I've had a full breadth of experience working on the AODA, but also as a lawyer, as a human rights lawyer, one of my clients, this related to an incident that happened in 2016 where a young woman who uses forearm crutches due to spina bifida was in a downtown Toronto restaurant, and she asked where the washroom was. So if you live in Toronto or any major center, the washrooms are invariably downstairs, usually a very scary part of the basement, and the restaurant employee actually physically barred my client from going down the stairs because she was afraid that my client would fall down the stairs, injure herself, and sue the restaurant. And so in 2017, we filed an application with the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario, and it grabbed a lot of interest because it's always interesting how you want to approach some human rights alleged discrimination. And so I had to carefully consider is this something that we want the media to know about? Or is this something that we want to keep internal? Because sometimes going to the media backfires. And so I very carefully considered it. My client agreed. We did send out a press release. But the way it worked was by saying that having access to a public washroom goes to the root of dignity, human dignity. Because consider if you are not able to have access to a washroom when you need it, what are your choices? None of them are dignified. And it was also that summer that there was a lot of conversation, and sadly still remains to be, on using the washroom according to how you identify by gender. And so it grabbed a lot of attention because I needed to make people care. And if it was somebody who doesn't live with a disability, they wouldn't care. They just like, oh, well, doesn't have anything to do with me. But if you frame it as a larger issue of human rights, then suddenly it matters. And I'm pleased to say that the Toronto Star placed the story on the front page of their newspaper above the fold. For those of you who have journalist background, this is a very big thing, with a large photo of my client as well as a continuation of the story with another large photo inside. And it went viral around the world. It was discussed in law firms, in law schools, among the human rights bar. It was very important. But it took until August of 2020. Now, this was filed in February of 2017. It took August of 2020 to finally get a decision from the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario, almost exactly 4 years from the date of the incident happening. But it was important because a precedent had been set. The Human Rights Tribunal agreed that yes, this was discriminatory. No, this was not permitted to happen anymore. And that decision again went viral. And so even though my client was awarded damages, compensation, the restaurant was long in the wind, had closed up their restaurant. There was nothing to be gained monetarily. But what was gained was just having the conversation happening. And it gave my client the validation that what happened to her was not right. And then the third win that I have, these are the major ones. In 2019, I created a social enterprise called HearView, but we can talk about that later in the podcast if you'd like, Mary.
Very much so. I think we wanted to get greater clarity around Clearview, and would love now to sort of get your impressions about the workplace. Are there common barriers to accessibility within the workplace that act to limit the participation of people with disabilities within the workforce? Are there issues that seem to come up again and again in different workplaces?
Yeah, now this is a very broad question, and so I will take a high level approach to answering it because there are easily full day workshops that can do a deeper dive onto this topic. So I'll share what I view are some of the most common barriers. First, you have your physical barriers, and such as an inaccessible entrance to the workplace. Are your workstations accessible for people who may be wheelchair users and are not physically able to use the workstation that is in place? Or maybe they have ergonomic accommodations that they need, a special chair or what have you. And there can be inadequate accommodations in common areas, such as, how's the accessible parking? Is the meeting space accessible? What about the washroom? As I was just saying, is there an accessible washroom for someone who may need it? And then, of course, there are the technological barriers where there may be a desire to use software and digital tools and technologies to be productive in the workplace, but those tools may lack compatibility with screen readers for those who have low vision. Your website may be inaccessible, or the internal platforms you use in the workplace may not be accessible. And there's virtual meeting tools such as the platform that we are using that does not allow for the incorporation of captioning. So this is why you may see me looking off to the screen, because this is where I have the captioning. And so those are just some examples of the technological barriers. And then the biggest one is attitudinal. The barriers where employers may perceive that people with disabilities are less capable, or that the accommodations will be too expensive or too difficult to do. And there's a lack of awareness on training and disability related issues, that they may be outdated, or they're filtered through that employer's understanding of the one person they may know with a particular disability that doesn't translate into their employees that may have the same disability but interact in a different way. And there tends to be a resistance. I think we've seen the change, though, since we faced the global pandemic, in that there was resistance to flexible work schedules or working from home, remote work, and that could be very essential for a lot of employees with disabilities. And you also have the policy and procedural barriers, whereas that some policies may not fully address the accommodation needs of their employees. They might not exist at all. We like to think that they all do have them, but not all. And the accommodation policies that do exist may be very unclear in terms of how does one request accommodation. And there might be a lot of inflexibility. Say you're an employee with a disability, and sometimes you need to go to medical appointments. And so the workplace might be inflexible about when these appointments happen. What if it goes long? We all know medical appointments rarely start on time. And there may be some other disability related needs that an employee needs to absent themselves from the workplace to manage. And there's also a lack of proactive in the hiring process, and the practices and how they write the job descriptions that may not be creating a welcoming space for employees with disabilities, and may actually be putting up barriers for that person. You also have communication barriers. If you do not have accessible format for, like, say, large print, braille, captioning, if your training and your orientation program are inaccessible, what if you have an employee who uses sign language, but you have no interpreters available? What happens? And you also need to think about the organizational culture, because sometimes accessibility and disability inclusion is not prioritized or integrated. And for example, a lot of talk since COVID started about diversity, equity, inclusion, or whatever acronym choice you want to use. But what is always missing, in my experience, is the A for accessibility. And so a lot of focus on other marginalized groups, but people with disabilities are often not included in that conversation. So that conveys the message that employees with disabilities are not a priority. And depending on your organizational culture, it may not be a safe space for an employee to feel comfortable to disclose that they have a disability because they're concerned about discrimination or retaliation. They need to have the job. They want to keep it. They don't want to cause any problem or be trouble. And so these are some of the barriers that are quite common. But in terms of the recurring issues that I've seen is there, and as a lawyer, I know that there's a failure to adhere to accessibility legislation like the AODA or the federal requirements. And these keep happening in spite of the laws being in place. This is not a nice thing to do. This is not optional. It's the law and you must do it. There's inconsistent applications of accommodation. So what one employee may get within the company to accommodate their disability, another employee may achieve more reasonable or suitable accommodation. And it can vary across large organizations that might have offices in different cities, that if there is not a cohesive approach to how accommodation is implemented across the board, you could see someone in Vancouver with a certain disability receiving far better or far worse accommodations than someone in Toronto. Very important is the underrepresentation of people with disabilities in leadership roles. And this restricts the influence that leaders who have disabilities can use the influence that they would have to shape a more inclusive workplace. And it's also providing role models for other employees with disabilities because we've all heard you can't be what you can't see. So if you don't have anyone to look up to that looks like you, then it can be very challenging and you do not feel like there's a commitment to inclusion and accessibility.
I wonder if you could define ableism for our audience. What are some common ways you see it showing up in the workplace?
Well, and ableism is an interesting term. No one should feel embarrassed if they don't know what it means, if they've never heard it. And I liken this to, again, how disability issues seem to be at the end of the civil rights movement, in that we've seen progress in other areas for the Black community, for women, or the LGBTQ community, but disability is still lagging. So what is ableism? Ableism is discrimination and prejudice or, social prejudice against people with disabilities based on the belief that typical non-disabled people, their abilities are superior. And this manifests in a number of ways. It manifests in attitudes that shows up in policies and practices that serve to devalue or limit the potential rights and experiences of employees with disabilities and people with disabilities in a broad sense. And it often assumes that people with disabilities are less capable, less productive, less worthy of the same opportunities as non-disabled people. And this, of course, creates unnecessary barriers to the full participation in society. So there are many common ways that ableism shows up in the workplace. And again, this is high level view because it does take a bit of unpacking, but I'll just give you a high level view. We already talked about attitude, the attitudinal biases and stereotyping, the lack of accommodation, the hiring and advancement discrimination. that someone may not be promoted on the basis of, oh, we don't think that person with a disability could possibly take on the extra work or manage a team. And we've got exclusion from opportunity, that being one, but exclusion happens in many other ways. You might be excluded from team building activities, meetings, professional development, and you may be excluded by virtue of the opportunities happening in spaces that are inaccessible, or no consideration has even been made to ensure that everyone who needs to be around the table is around the table. And you could also be overlooking talent. When you overlook the unique strength of people with disabilities. And I like to point out to employers and others that PWDs, people with disabilities, PWDs, I'm not a big fan of the superpowers narrative that is going on. I think it borders on inspiration porn, and I'm not about that at all. But PWDs have creativity, determination, problem solving, reliability, they have resilience, they have time management, because we have extra things we need to do in our day that people who do not live with disability do not even have to think about. If you are a wheelchair user, you need to consider, how am I going to get to a location? I have to book Wheel-Trans. Is the subway station accessible? All of these things we have to troubleshoot. And those things are all taking creativity. You have to manage your time. Those are all things that make you a very worthy employee. And then you've got the inaccessible communication and technology that I already mentioned. You've got the microaggressions that happen in the workplace. For example, there are harmful remarks or jokes that can happen that demean people with disabilities, or they reinforce stereotypes. And you might call someone inspirational, but we're just doing ordinary things with extraordinary difficulty. There's nothing inspirational about that. It just highlights the barriers that we face every day to do what those without disability take very much for granted. And especially throughout COVID, we've seen a rise in non-apparent disabilities. I prefer that term over invisible or hidden disabilities, particularly around mental health and wellness. And there can be a skepticism, or you could be asked repeatedly to justify any accommodation you need because it's not visible. You can't see it. So if you can't see it, can you believe it? And can you respect the individual who's making the request? And ableism also has a punitive nature to it, in that if employers don't understand disability-related needs, they may penalize employees for taking time off for medical appointments or disability-related absences. And the employee may create, and the employer may create an environment whereby the employee feels pressure to disclose their disability, even when they don't want to, in order to get the necessary accommodations or understanding. And if that safe space isn't there, that is very problematic, and employees typically don't end up staying, where they're constantly feeling under attack in subtle and not so subtle ways. Then I already mentioned that the policies may reflect ableism, where they're non-inclusive policies that don't account for diverse needs, and the lack of representation in leadership. And that is a way of perpetuating systemic ableism because the policies may not reflect the needs or the perspective of employees with disabilities. And so those are just some ways that I can see on a high level that are problematic around ableism that people may not realize is actually a thing. And it's very much a thing. And it's the root of disability discrimination applications that help consistently. Over 50% of applications to provincial, territorial, federal human rights commissions and tribunals are on the basis of discrimination relating to disability. And that number has been pretty consistent. It's not going down. So something we need to consider.
Thank you. That was a great explanation of ableism. Part of your legal work has included representing people with disabilities who have faced discrimination at work. Can you talk a little bit about how this discrimination can occur or really expand on an organization's duty to accommodate?
Duty to accommodate is a biggie. Again, that takes up like a whole full day. I've warned my law students in class that there is a full 3-hour lecture on the duty to accommodate alone. So again, high level, and I won't be doing a deep dive, but workplace discrimination can happen and take various forms when an employer intentionally or unintentionally treat an employee or a job candidate unfairly based on the characteristics and protected by human rights law, and this circumstance, disability. And it can show up at all stages of employment, from recruitment to hiring to job assignment, promotion, and termination. And so, in the context of disability, discrimination often happens when employers fail to uphold their duty to accommodate and doesn't provide an inclusive environment. So, what are some forms of workplace discrimination? We have direct discrimination, and that is when an individual is explicitly treated less favorably due to their disability. For example, an employer may refuse to hire a person with a disability solely because they use a wheelchair. We don't want wheelchair users here. Or even better, we don't hire people confined to wheelchairs, which is so inappropriate on so many levels. Or the employer could just openly state that they won't accommodate an individual's need. And so those are examples of direct discrimination. They do happen. Hopefully with education, it's happening less and less. I'd like to say I believe that more, but what I was saying about more than half application bears out that that's not happening yet. So that's direct discrimination. Then we also have indirect discrimination, commonly referred to as systemic discrimination. So these are policies or practices that appear neutral on the surface, like they're benign, but they disproportionately affect people with disabilities. So, for example, if a company requires employees to work from an inaccessible office building or mandate long working hours without considering the needs of employees with chronic illness, for example, and that can result in discrimination if that policy applies to all employees across the board. And we have the failure to accommodate, which I've already talked about, limiting the employee's ability to participate fully in the workplace. The creation of a work environment that has harassment or hostility as part of the environment. So an employee could be faced with offensive remarks or jokes or behavior relating to their disability. So that negatively impacts on an employee's well-being and performance. And like I said, if you have not created a safe space, there should be no surprise why PWD employees will leave. They will not hang around. I already talked about retaliation and how if you're an employee who is asserting their right, you may be faced with demotion, dismissal, or exclusion from work opportunities. So the duty to accommodate in the workplace, very high level. There are key aspects to the duty to accommodate. First, it needs to be reasonable accommodation, not perfect, but reasonable. You need to accommodate to the point of undue hardship. And so what does that mean? So undue hardship happens when the cost or the impact of the accommodation is too high or poses significant health or safety risk in the workplace. But the threshold for proving undue hardship is very high. And you need to consider the employer needs to consider factors like cost. Is there outside funding? What is the size of the workplace? Employers cannot claim undue hardship based on a minor inconvenience. For example, if you are a small employer and somebody is saying, I need an elevator to get up to the second floor or whatever, and it's maybe less than 10 employees. Well, that is going to obviously create an undue hardship. But accommodations also need to be individualized and they must be tailored to the specific need of the person because no two employees with disabilities are the same. If you have met one person who is blind and have accommodated that person, well, congratulations, you met one person. There are going to be many other ways that someone else who is blind or has low vision needs to be accommodated. So you have to be open-minded and you also have to be proactive in your accommodation. You as an employer have a responsibility to build accessibility into your hiring practices and make your workspaces physically accessible, ensure that digital platforms meet accessibility standards, and work on focusing that inclusive organizational structure and the culture, because we've often heard that when it comes to accessibility, it is far more expensive to retrofit than it is to correct. And so you need to filter things through a disability lens to find out who is going to be using the space. How are they impacted in a negative way, and be proactive so that you remove that barrier from the beginning. And it should go without saying that disability accommodations are private and confidential, and they should only the employer should only be requesting the information necessary to provide the appropriate accommodation. And for example, employers don't have a right to know the diagnosis. All they need to know is this employee requires this accommodation to do the task of the job assigned. It's irrelevant what the diagnosis may be. So there's a lot of challenges, and this is where the human rights applications come into play when you're looking at the challenges of accommodating employees. So mentioned some of these before, the lack of awareness or knowledge. You don't know where to start, how to start. And I always stress, progress over perfection. And because this is a conversation that employers need to have with their employees, their roles and responsibilities on both sides. Already talked about the inconsistent implementation of accommodation, which will lead to disparities among across employees. Fear of disclosing disability is very real. It's not something that people can say, oh, that can't surely happen. It does a lot. And there's still a lot of stigma and discrimination around disability, the cost of the perceived burden, and that while many accommodations are low cost, less than $500, maybe a one-time cost only, some employers perceive any accommodation to come with significant cost or inconvenience, and that makes them resistant to accommodation, making the changes that they need. But on the flip side, the positive side, there are a lot of good things that happen when employers thoughtfully, proactively uh, get a very strong accommodation policy and put it in place to meet the legal duty. So you have increased productivity from your employees because they're more productive, they're more engaged, and they're satisfied with their job. They can do their jobs well. Happy employees stay. So there's more retention and recruitment, and this attracts diverse talent and reduces employee turnover. And because turnover is expensive. And so I think now what we've seen with COVID is that remote work is a huge attractive benefit for attracting talent with or without disabilities. I've said this many times already. The legal compliance is the law. Do this and you will avoid the potential legal penalties. And not only that, a reputational harm that can come from that. And then fostering an inclusive culture based on respect and inclusion where all employees feel valued and supported. It's a win-win for the employer and the employees. And so those are just some very high-level thoughts that I have. I apologize if my answer was long, but it's a big topic, Mary, so I hope I was okay with that.
Well, you covered off a lot of the things that I wanted to ask you. I do want to end with an opportunity to talk about HearView. Back in 2019, you founded a company called HearView. Can you tell us a bit about why you created it and what you were addressing by doing so?
Yes, I created HearView in 2019 out of my own frustration because I like to attend live events like anybody else, any conferences or things like that. In fact, Mary, I think that's how you and I first met. Gosh, was it only 5 years ago? It feels like 50, with COVID time. But I created it because I was very frustrated with wanting to attend live events, reaching out to the organizer or the venue to say, this is what I need in order for the event to be accessible to me. What I needed was captioning. And I was constantly being told, no, it's not being offered. Nobody's asked for it. We don't know how it works. It's too expensive. Not right now. All of these things. And I was just, there was an event that happened in 2018 that I really, really wanted to go to. It was an international human rights lawyer speaking. And when I got that no, something just snapped. Absolutely snapped. And I said, enough, no more. So I created this social enterprise with the view of removing the no. And I said I picked about a dozen women's events, because I know women would be hopefully more likely to buy in. And I said, I will provide the captioners at no cost. I will train your AV team. I will, do all of these things for you. All you need to say is yes. And so I had ended up with, I think, about a dozen events. And I don't know if you're a big believer in manifestation, but I was reading a book in June of 2019 that was Michelle Obama's book. Who hasn't read Becoming? And so there was a pivotal moment in that book because I had stepped away from human rights law, frustrated by the backlogs and the trauma it was causing my clients. And I thought I need to just step back a bit, consider what I could do differently in the meantime. So I'm reading Michelle's book, and partway through her book, she talks about Michelle, who is also a lawyer, talks about leaving private practice at a large law firm and going to work in a community setting within a hospital as being a way of aligning with her values. And that was a key moment for me because she said it was okay to do that. So when we go to law school, it's drilled into us that we must be, working in a large Bay Street firm and that we must aspire to be a partner after so many years and this and that and all the accoutrements that come with making large amounts of money if you're a corporate lawyer. Not all of us are corporate lawyers. And so we don't have those same dreams. And that moment of reading the book, I thought, you know what? Yeah, it is okay. It is okay for me to pivot. Long before the word pivot was much more popular. And I said to myself, I'm going to create this social enterprise. And Michelle Obama is going to be our very first client. Had no idea how, no idea when, how, or anything. She had finished doing her Cross Canada promotional tour for her book. No indication she would be back in Canada. Within a month, I incorporated Hairview. Within 2 months, I had my first live event with the Hairview as a Hairview sponsor for an event. And within 2 months of incorporating my company, my social enterprise, the first major event with Hairview was with Michelle Obama in Canada. And so after then, there were a number of large events with Women's College Hospital and the Canadian Women's Foundation. And these organizations were seeing the value of communication inclusion because I also had to educate. This was not just for those people who live with hearing loss. It supports people who have learning disabilities, people who have English as a second language, people who may not have difficulty hearing until they're in a large venue where the acoustics are not very good. And so, in essence, whenever you have an audible means of relaying communication, you should also have a visual means. Hugely popular, had tons of clients lined up to pay for the services, but for one little thing, 5 months after I set up Hairview and was well on our way, everybody was so excited and talked with Oprah for her Canadian tour. We got a global pandemic happening. And silly me didn't put a global pandemic in my business plan. So that was fine. It was a bit sad for a while because I had put up my own money up front to make all of these sponsorships happening. But I showed how the culture can shift in a very short time. And I also realized I just wanted to create the impact. I was not interested in running a captioning agency. And so when COVID happened, there was the shift to virtual platforms. And then people started to get more involved with where the auto-generated captioning, which is not the best. And slowly people are starting to have those large events in person and are using captioning. So I'm proud of that, even though it was a huge financial loss to me. It was gratifying to me to see that the culture can change and it does shift when you're doing things that need to be done. You're doing it with passion and you're crafting arguments that simply make sense. So that's the story of Peerview. It's now still the name of my consulting company, whereas I do more training and speaking engagements, and like you said, I'm teaching at the law school. And but I'm not providing captioning services. I could certainly, refer people. But the website is still up there at Hearview, HEARVUE.com. And you'll see some pictures of those events that we did have. And I'm still beating the drum on communication inclusion. And I've learned that since COVID, people with all the streaming platforms, Netflix and Apple Plus and Amazon Prime and that, they are consciously selecting to have the subtitles on there. And because you don't know what you missed if you don't know what you missed. And so I'm excited. Can you tell I'm a bit passionate about this show? But that's a good thing, isn't it?
Well, that is a wonderful story. I'd like to finish our discussion with future gazing. Looking ahead over the next 5 to 10 years, what do you feel is imperative for Canada to address to better support people with disabilities, especially when it comes to workplaces?
Let me see. 5 years. I don't tend to have a 5-year plan. I tend to do a 3-month plan because so much could change in 3 months, right? But this is an important question. Um, Certainly, we need to strengthen and enforce accessibility legislation. That is not happening. The enforcement piece of it, we have the Accessible Canada Act that aims to create a barrier-free country by 2040. What people don't realize is that only applies to organizations within the federal government jurisdiction. It's not a panacea for everything that happens in the country. And we also need to have provincial alignment with those federal goals because we have the AODA, which is Ontario, and numerous provinces have variations of the same, but they're not the same as the AODA at all. And we need to align those provincial and territorial legislation with the federal goals. We need to, no question, continue to eliminate barriers to employment through inclusive hiring practices, retention and career advancement, enhancing digital accessibility. Again, an ongoing measure that we need to do. Address those attitudinal barriers and combating ableism. I love the Paralympics. The International Paralympic Committee had a campaign during the most recent Paralympics that I thought was extremely effective in combating ableism in that it said Paralympians are not participating, they are competing in the game. And this past March, several associations for Down syndrome crafted a 90-second video that talked about ableist attitude toward a young woman with Down syndrome. Basically, if you assume that I can't drink and I can't live on my own and all of those things, if you assume that, guess what? That's what I'm going to do. But if you do not assume that, I am going to live independently. I'm going to do all those things without restriction. So there needs to be a cultural shift towards inclusion. And we have to reduce the stigma. You already mentioned this about those who have non-apparent disabilities. And because mental health, the number you quoted at the beginning in the introduction, about 27% of Canadians you were talking about employment statistics, but out of that same survey, and that was released in December of 2023, there are 27% of Canadians identifying with one or more disabilities. Those are the only people who self-identified. I would venture a guess that the number is much higher. Why is it as low as it is, which is still a 5% jump over 5 years ago? It's low because the stigma continued, but it has grown due to mental health issues, the aging of our population, and that will only continue to grow. We need to ensure equitable accommodations in the workplace. Like I mentioned, they need to be proactive, and there has to be inclusive policies for remote work. It has to be formalized, which I don't believe is quite there yet. Certainly within the legal profession, there is we want you in the office at least 3 days a week. But for some, that might not be viable, and a lot of pushback is happening because employees without disabilities are seeing the work-life balance that can happen. And we also, again, with the accommodation, the flexible arrangement, within 5 years, I would want to see an expansion of the federal or the financial incentives for accessible workplace so the government can provide support and subsidy, because some costs around accommodation or incentive to make your physical spaces accessible can be prohibitive for some employers. And there's a lot of workplace innovation that is going on that we have seen come out of COVID, so that needs to continue. Supporting mental health in the workplace, we're going to see that, I would think, become a core focus for workplace wellness. Data collection and accountability. Data drive decisions. And so if we're forced to rely on American data that is not appropriate to Canada, or numbers from 5 years ago that don't accurately depict what is happening, we can't expect to have meaningful change going on around that. Representation and leadership. I would want to see more mentorship and leadership programs to foster that inclusion in decision making that's coming from a lived experience, and collaboration with disability advocacy groups. So because they're partners in change, and so often there is competition, a fierce competition for a piece of the pie when it comes to funding, and we need to change that to be more inclusive and viewing those disability advocacy groups as agents of change. So that's what I hope to see within the next 5 years. Hard to know if that'll happen, but that's my grown-up Christmas wish list, I guess, of things that I hope to see happen.
Well, Lorin, I want to thank you for your advocacy and work to improve accessibility and human rights law, along with your invaluable advice to nonprofit and charitable organizations who are employers in Canada about how to break down barriers and make their workplaces, their programs, and communities more welcoming and accessible. Thanks for joining Charity Village Connects.
Thank you so much for having me for this very important conversation. I'm quite passionate about that. And Charity Village is such a valuable partner in creating that awareness. And so I thank you, Mary, for inviting me, and let's make change happen.
I'm with you on that. Thank you, Lorin.